The EU LCS conference system has been a bit controversial since it started this year because there have been all sorts of things like the Rocket situation where if Rocket were in a different group, they'd really make it out and all these other things. But okay, preface, I like the conference system. I like the conference system that's in LPL. It was in LPL for a year before EU LCS, and even though you get imbalanced groups sometimes, I think it's really rewarding because some weeks one team only plays one other team and you have the focused practice just to prepare for this match, and I think it's really rewarding. And if you're going to do best of threes, you don't want to just bog teams down with like this constant grind of matches. You want to give them something to really practice for, or something to prepare for, or something really interesting to compete over, to look forward, instead of just preparing for multiple teams every week, all in all the time. So I like the conference system. I think it's really cool, and there are great storylines and things like this that come out of are these teams playing like a slightly different meta? Did it happen that we put all the good tops in one group? Things like this that I think are really fun. But a little bit tweaking can be done to something that is intrinsic to the cross-conference system, which is the draw format. And this has recently been kind of a bit of a chatter within both the EU LCS and the LPL. Both regions have this kind of cross-conference format, because in the EU LCS, when the draw came out and the groups were basically exactly the same except for the new teams, people said, oh, this is boring. But when the LPL draw came out and people looked at it, at the groups, and they said that, there were some changes and stuff, but Group A looks way stronger than Group B, like way stronger in terms of teams and stacking, so it just doesn't look very, I think even EU LCS, Group A looks maybe a little bit stronger than Group B, but it's not near, like, the level of the LPL. So I wanted to talk about the difference in formats, the pluses and minuses of both of them, and then I had a proposition that I think kind of combines aspects of both that I think would be fun to see implemented or to see talked about more if people wanted to change how groups were drawn in the future. So first, let's kind of talk about the group draw systems. Let's just iron them out. Let's get it going. So in the EU LCS, which is probably the system that people watching this video are most familiar with, okay, so the winning teams are each put into different groups, and by winning teams I mean first place and second place in the EU LCS in the previous split. And this is good because it rewards teams for doing well in the past split and things like this, okay? So from there, team with the highest seed, so the first place team in Group A, will choose a team to go into Group B. In the EU LCS this past split, it was G2 Esports in Group A, Unicorns of Love in Group B. G2 Esports went ahead and they picked H2K. Unicorns of Love then picked Fnatic. Okay, and then from there it goes where the next seeded team goes ahead and picks the team in the opposite group and things like this all the way down until Mysterious Monkeys were the last team chosen by Rocket for Group B. Okay, so this is a simple format, right? It's got a little bit of excitement, a little bit of hype, because the teams are choosing their fates, they're deciding who ends up where. This type of situation, it feels more competitive because the teams probably have a pretty good idea of what other teams are really strong based on scrims, and I actually hate using scrim results as indicators, but I think as scrim culture gets more competitive and things like this, there have been less complaints about this team that, they just do insane in scrims and they flop on stage like this, like Rocket used to be all the time. And there will always be some of that to an extent, because playing on stage is not the same as a scrim, just fundamentally. Now, of course, the audience was a little bit disappointed because these are the same groups, and there weren't even a lot of roster changes in the teams during the regular split, so you're kind of hoping for different group shakeouts, so there's just a little less predictability, right? It doesn't feel like it's the same. And then even when the EU LCS started, you had Misfits having some of the same problems, even though they had their roster changes, and it just feels very familiar, except for the new teams. So the LPL, on the opposite side, I actually thought the LPL would have almost the same system this time because of the way that they've worded it as having a new format. It's not really a new format, they just made it more theatrical, right? What happens now is that in the LPL, there are 4 pools of teams that are seeded based upon how they did in the previous split. So same way, you have the top pool, which puts the best 2 teams in separate groups, theoretically. WE in Group A, where I'll never give up, in Group B. So same setup. And then from there, you have pools from there where it's the remaining 4 of the top 6 teams, and then you have the next rung of 4 teams that made playoffs or made it out of relegation first, and then at the bottom you have the last 2 teams to either come back from the relegation tournament or to join from the LSPL. You have these pools for a reason, but then you have teams on stage choosing randomly from these pools teams that will go in the opposite group, which is a slight difference because it used to just be like Messiah and a bunch of other personalities picking teams in each group, but now they actually have the representatives go on stage. They have like the journalists sit there and then they say, oh, which teams do you really want to go in the other group? Like if you could choose, which team would you put in the other group? And of course both RNG and WE say EDG, and then RNG draws newbie, which is, or excuse me, WE draws newbie, which is for sure the weakest team in the top 6. Like, there's no way. Absolutely, and puts them in RNG. So this is kind of how it pans out, because then RNG draws EDG and puts it in with newbie, or with WE. So you can see how this slowly pans out and makes Group B end up being a little bit weaker. So the issue with this group draw is, obviously it's exciting, it's kind of fun, it lends itself to a little bit of theatricality. You aren't going to end up with the same groups every split, right? 2 splits in a row, that's going to be really, really hard to come by. And you have some new storylines and stuff like this emerging from that. Of course, you also can easily get one-sided groups because of randomization and stuff like this, which is not fun. And then of course, if teams change really drastically between splits, and you're basing the pools on placements in the previous split, you run the risk of having a team suddenly lose all of their good players and be a dud, right? Or a team suddenly gain a bunch of good players and then just make the group imbalanced because they're in a lower rung and they're chosen into an already strong group. For example, between 2015 summer and 2016 spring, LGD Gaming won the LPL 2015 summer, almost didn't make it to playoffs in 2016 spring. So obviously there's not a lot you can do about cases that extreme, but it made their group really, really weak. So what do you do? What's a good format? I think that based on what we've seen, the EU LCS setup might be a little bit more competitive, a little bit more based on teams choosing their own fate and stuff like this. And then Group B is just kind of more fun and crazy, and it provides more variety, and viewers might like it a little bit more. Now, I kind of like sticking with Group A with the EU LCS format a little bit, but I think that there's an alternative that will add a little bit of randomization to this type of format if you integrate aspects of both of them. So first of all, I like the tier system, but I think the tier system is imperfect if it's just based strictly on the previous split. So I think something that could combine both is if teams decide on tiers. Okay, so they submit ballots and say that we think these teams belong in this tier. So each of the teams have like separate ballots and separate predictions for this type of thing. And then teams are seeded based on that. Of course, teams will always skew their own results and stuff like this, which is why you need to have them pick everything but themselves and then average them out and see kind of, or have a good idea about where these go, and maybe have an expert make tiebreakers and things like this. Like these little nitty-gritty details will have to be ironed out, of course. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I think that deciding tiers as teams will eliminate some of the weirdness that happens when you draw like a newbie or something like this. Because newbie was a huge upset that they kind of beat IG a little bit. So if you do that type of picking of the pools, it's a little bit more rigorous, and then you can go and you can do the LPL aspect of the random draw. So you still have the randomization, and you still have groups kind of forced to shake up a little bit, but you have teams deciding their fate, you have a general consensus of where teams are in terms of strength and weaknesses, and you're not going to end up in the same kind of comfortable groups again. And I think that there are other motivating factors for why teams could have picked the same groups, right? Consistent scrim partners when you're playing in conference, things like this, just being comfortable, kind of understanding and having already studied these teams really, really well more recently, and being able to predict kind of what they will do. And I think that there's that kind of impetus for teams picking groups that they were where they were, maybe not too much, because it's just, again, you're playing them one more time. But you know where you ended up in a group when these teams were in this group, right? And if it was favorable for you, right, since you're put up on top, you're the one picking from teams below you, then you're incentivized to pick similar situations, to pick a situation that you know that you can do well in. So I think adding some of that randomization might also have a competitive factor that helps the way that the season rolls out. Now, some people might say, okay, you're incentivized to pool together and collectively like screw over this guy by putting him in a small seat. That doesn't work, right? Because obviously, if you do that, if you mess up the order, then you could end up putting in a situation where you have a ton of strong teams just going in your group suddenly because you put a bunch of strong teams in pools that they didn't belong in. And so now they're in your group, and you have a much harder time getting to playoffs, a much harder time getting to the finals, and maybe you don't care if you're G2, but in general, I don't think that would pan out, or that would happen. I think that teams would have a much better incentive to pick groups that actually make sense, to pick pools that actually make sense.